Welcome back. And as we've been telling you all morning, an historic ruling in the U.S. as former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin convicted on all charges in the death of George Floyd.
A lot of days that I prayed and I hoped and I was speaking everything into existence. I said, I have faith that he will be convicted.
And members of Floyd's family say this move, a step in the right direction, but yes, a lot of work still needs to be done. Chauvin convicted on all 3 charges, including second and third degree murder in the death of Floyd last May. The case sparking worldwide protests and forcing police all over the world to re-examine protocol, racism, bias, and this verdict hitting close to home. We are going to join right now Darryl Forges, who is in Minneapolis for us this morning. Darryl, we saw when the verdict was announced what the crowd's their reaction was like. Some call it celebration. Some say this is just what had to be done. Good morning to you, and can you tell us what the mood is like today?
Yeah, Melanie, good morning to you. As Derek Chauvin wakes up behind bars this morning, the mood and atmosphere here in Minneapolis has changed drastically compared to what we saw for the past few weeks, even as far back as May of last year when George Floyd lost his life. Now, I can tell you, we saw a large law enforcement presence leading up to this verdict. We saw a lot of officers from out of town, out of state, and we even saw as much as 3,000 National Guardsmen here on the ground in the Twin Cities alone because of the amount of protesters we've seen here for the past few weeks, as well as what happened after George Floyd died of the Black Lives Matter movement protests in May, June, and July. But Melanie, I can tell you, as soon as that verdict was announced by Judge Peter Cahill that Derek Chauvin was guilty on all 3 of those charges, it was like a big sigh of relief from a lot of people all across this area. People started crying, hugging each other, embracing one another. We also saw people dancing and screaming. And for George Floyd's family, they say that, yes, this is justice for them. They are happy. Thelonious Floyd was inside of the courtroom when that verdict was announced, and he was shaking. He was praying that the verdict would be in his family's favor, but he says there's still more work to be done when it comes to justice for unarmed black people who die at the hands of police. Melanie, just 10 miles away from where I'm standing is Brooklyn Center. That's where Daunte Wright lost his life, and his funeral is set for tomorrow. And Thelonious Floyd says that he's going to continue to fight for people like Daunte Wright, like Breonna Taylor, like those who've lost their lives at the hands of police. So he's hoping that not only is this a victory, yes, for his family and for George Floyd and justice, but hopefully this is a start of something else, a bigger movement moving forward.
That is the hope, Darryl. And sadly, what we're seeing in the headlines yet again, 16-year-old Mikaya Bryant in Ohio, shot and killed by police. And so for many waking up this morning saying, okay, this was, yes, definitely a step forward, but are we taking steps backward? And will people be held accountable, regardless if they are, or definitely if they are police in this scenario, will they be held accountable?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Ohio, but Melanie, this is the example that the family George Floyd talked about, especially when they were on the phone with Vice President Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden on the phone. One of the biggest things that Benjamin Crump said was he really hopes that Congress can pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. That act is really big when it comes to police reform. That means getting rid of no-knock warrants and also banning chokeholds and other things when it comes to reforming how policing is done in the United States. Now, as you can imagine, we've gone through a lot of issues with bipartisanship, a lot of gridlock in Washington, and the big question is, will that pass at some point when it comes to reforming how police do their job? And so we're going to see this fight continue all across this country as to what needs to be done. Again, what's happened in Brooklyn Center, what happened in Ohio, what's happening all across this country is what Black Americans fear the most, is when their child is in the car driving. When they get pulled over by an officer, will they come back home alive? That's a fear for many African Americans all across this country, and they're hoping that something eventually will get done about it.
Darryl, very quickly for you before you go, what are the next steps when it comes to sentencing?
Well, Melanie, Derek Chauvin will be sentenced in about 8 weeks from now, and that's going to be a big decision left up to Judge Peter Cahill. The judge will be looking at several aggravating factors when it comes to the overall sentence. Derek Chauvin will be looking at least a minimum of 12.5 years in prison, but the prosecution wants more. They want a big increase in that. That's why Judge Peter Cahill will be looking at those aggravating factors, including the fact that Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd in front of a 9-year-old girl that we heard from earlier during the trial proceedings, and also the position that George Floyd was in at the time of his death. Those are the biggest things that Judge Peter Cahill will be looking at for the next 8 weeks. So yes, at least Chauvin is looking at about 12.5 years in prison, but the max is about 40 years in prison, Melanie.
All right, Darryl Forges reporting live in Minneapolis. Thank you for your time. We'll talk to you again in about 2 hours. Okay, 7:33 is what we're sitting at right now. We're going to bring in Frankie because as I look out this window, yours looks worse.